So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's Rob Savage. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education. And I'd like to begin today's event by acknowledging the land that we're currently situated on, of course. So we recognise that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. We, at York University, acknowledge its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, the area known as Takaronto, caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Huon-Wendat, now home to many First Nation, Inuit and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So fundamental to, foundational to today, our acknowledgement. Before we begin, you may have noticed that this lecture is being recorded. I can reassure you the audience will not be filmed. Okay. It will be shared via my office via email and posted on our websites along with the previous lectures. This is, I think I'm correct in saying, the fifth of the public lecture series. And the idea behind the public lecture series was very much to share with the wider public, in the spirit of public education, some of the exciting research that we're doing in the faculty and putting it out there. So this work will add to a repository that will be growing semester on semester of the rich tapestry of research and scholarship and thinking that's taking place in the faculty. I'm very proud of that, very proud that we're here to celebrate the next chapter in that work, as it were, today. So thank you for joining us. This is the fifth event in our public lecture series entitled Teachers' Professional Fulfilment and Why It Matters. The talk will be delivered by Dr. Sarah Barrett, who is a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University. Dr. Barrett has held the position of Associate Dean, Academic Programmes and Undergraduate Programme Director, and is currently the university's Affirmative Action, Equity and Inclusivity Officer. She has previously been a high school science and math teacher. In 2022, Dr. Barrett was awarded the Faculty of Education Dean's Research Impact Award for her work exploring the ways in which classroom teachers experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was my privilege to give you that award back a few years ago. Professor Barrett's report, Emergency Distant Education During the COVID-19 Pandemic, was one of the first of its kind to offer comprehensive analysis of teachers' experiences at one of the most difficult times in the profession. As a scholar, Dr. Barrett has a long-standing interest in understanding teachers' experiences of how their values and beliefs influence their practice. This forms the foundation of her research on the ethical aspects of environmental education and professional teaching, teaching science for social justice, science teacher education, and developing more inclusive high school science curricula. Please therefore join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Barrett. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, everyone, for just being here. I really appreciate your taking the time just to think about some of these ideas that have been going around my mind actually since that study that I did with the teachers during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I also want to thank Rob for a really generous introduction. So, of course, we're looking at teachers' professional fulfillment, and I'm well aware of the fact that we're in a teacher shortage, that is actually in the background. So that is in the back of my mind as we talk about this. But I'm going to start by talking a bit about a teacher who participated in a longitudinal study that I did a few years ago. Anne is a science teacher and former engineer who I followed for a couple of years, and I was conducting interviews and visiting her classroom. At the time, she was just emerging out of the new teacher phase of her career. And you may or may not know that a teacher is considered to be a new teacher for about 5 years. And there is a reason for that. The job is a complex enough one that it really does take about 5 years for a teacher to feel confident in their practice, having developed their skills in accurately assessing students' academic progress and well-being, and reading the mood of a room full of kids, and planning lessons, and the logistical aspects of their work, including managing the physical classroom. So the 5-year mark is often the point when teachers consistently feel settled in their role. So over the course of a 6-day schedule, Anne taught about 200 elementary school students, ranging from 5-year-olds in grade 1 to 14-year-olds in grade 8. Her large classroom was equipped with large tables with plenty of room for students to work on the projects. There were floor-to-ceiling cupboards lined along one long wall, and they were all full of equipment. And the student projects that were in progress were also stacked up against the wall. And there were posters all over the room describing not only the scientific method and how to investigate problems, but also posters describing a child-friendly version of an engineering cycle for building prototypes and testing and refining. But probably the most prominent aspect of the classroom, at least while I was visiting, was a large catapult designed to send a stuffed angry bird flying to hit a stuffed pig. Her grade 7 classes were building miniature versions of this for their study unit on forces. Beyond the physical aspects of her classroom, what was most remarkable about it was the way that Anne inhabited it. Her classroom was a destination for science, as she called it. This was the space in the school where science happened, and her students all knew it. They knew that when they entered that room, they were all doing science, and they were all scientists. Anne wanted her students to become comfortable with making mistakes and to investigate the questions that arose as they did their work. So, Anne was teaching the courses the way she wanted to teach them. She was in a space where it was possible to teach in the way she wanted to, and she was able to bring her background as an engineer to her practice. There is no doubt in my mind that Anne was professionally fulfilled. But at the time when I was conducting the study with Anne, I wouldn't have used the term professional fulfillment. In fact, I didn't really think about teachers' professional fulfillment until I was faced with its exact opposite. When I was studying teachers' experiences of teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic, I interviewed and surveyed many teachers. As teachers described how it felt to engage in what we now call emergency remote teaching and learning, or ERTL, one emotion that was predominant was grief. Teachers expressed this grief in various ways, but one high school history teacher's survey response really stood out for me because it represented well what I was hearing from many of the teachers in both the interviews and the surveys. They said, "I feel like I'm now doing a job that I don't even recognize anymore. I hate my job, and I have limited motivation or interest in it. I would not have said this before." So I think at that moment, more than a decade into their career, that this teacher was definitely not professionally fulfilled. They had gotten to a point where they just didn't want to do the job anymore. But what was going on here? Grief is a response to a significant loss, but what exactly had been lost? In her book, Primary Teachers Talking, A Study of Teaching as Work, Dr. Jennifer Nias says, "Teachers are emotionally committed to many different aspects of their jobs. This is not an indulgence. It is a professional necessity. Without feeling, without the freedom to face themselves, to be whole persons in the classroom, they implode, explode, or walk away." That survey respondent, quoted earlier, seemed to be on the precipice of that decision to stay or go. They sound burnt out. Now, I could talk about the specifics of what was causing their professional crisis and describe the various shades of misery that I observed in many teachers' responses to my questions. But I really want to see what we can learn by exploring the opposite of that misery. Because through it, teachers did articulate what they need in order to stay present and energetic, innovative and curious in their careers. So my goal tonight is to explore a concept that can encompass a positive experience of teaching practice, and that concept is professional fulfillment. However, this aspect of teachers' experience is complicated. Professional fulfillment, as I'm defining it, is I imagine it as an individual's sense of satisfaction in the work they do in their chosen profession. And for teachers, I believe that this sense of satisfaction is based in part on the values and beliefs that they bring to their work. That is, the beliefs shape their experiences, and their assessment of their experiences are done through a lens that is their values. So I'm just going to define each of these things. So beliefs are interesting, at least to me. I tend to define them as knowledge that may or may not be empirically based, to which one is emotionally attached. Teachers' beliefs affect how they teach. For example, a teacher who believes that all students, given the time and motivation, can learn anything, is going to work with struggling students differently than a teacher who believes that it all boils down to innate talent and not every student has it. I divide beliefs into two categories: espoused beliefs and enacted beliefs. Espoused beliefs are the beliefs that people express when asked. Enacted beliefs are the actions people take. And teachers' espoused beliefs might be about the best way to teach, the nature of the subject being taught, student characteristics, and the professional culture of the school. They also relate to what teachers see as a reasonable work-life balance. Teachers' enacted beliefs include the choices that they make about what to teach when, as well as how they choose to teach, like whether they choose to do a lecture or facilitate group work or activities. These choices are utterly dependent on context, like the material and temporal resources available, student characteristics, professional culture, mandated curriculum, and on and on. And so this is where enacted beliefs come in. Enacted beliefs are actions in which teachers have an emotional stake. So for example, a teacher taking attendance is just an action. That same teacher deciding not to meet with a student who skipped their class during the lunch period to review the work that they missed, that's an enacted belief. Espoused beliefs and enacted beliefs are often not aligned for teachers. For example, if I were to talk to the aforementioned teacher about their beliefs about teaching, they might say that they believe every student deserves a second chance, and accommodations should always be made to help them to learn. But in practice, they have to consider the expectation that they will discipline students, the need to avoid setting problematic precedents, and perhaps even the fact that they feel offended that this student chose not to attend their class. These considerations might cause the teacher to act in a way that is contrary to the beliefs they had espoused, while still acting in line with their beliefs about what they need to do in that moment. And beliefs affect each other, as if they are the nodes in a web. Circumstances cause some beliefs to have more pull at particular times, and the line between espoused beliefs and enacted beliefs is not as sharp as one might expect. Nevertheless, the tension between these espoused and enacted beliefs over time just lost my spot. Don't worry, I'll find it again. Here we go. Nevertheless, the tension between these espoused and enacted beliefs over time can be corrosive, and burnout is possible. As a result, sorry, every time I touch my screen, it does weird things. As a result, indeed, as Jennifer Nias notes, the teacher might choose to walk away. The significance of this for professional fulfillment is that, as is true for anyone, a teacher will feel more comfortable when their espoused and enacted beliefs are aligned. I have, for many years, interviewed teachers about the tension that arises when espoused beliefs and enacted beliefs are not aligned with each other. And I have come to believe that the tensions they feel are caused by their values. And this is where crisis comes in. A crisis is a circumstance that forces one to make decisions, the ramifications of which are significant, and when faced with a crisis, our values become undeniable. The COVID-19 pandemic was a crisis. Schools all over the world closed their school buildings and rapidly transitioned to emergency remote teaching and learning. When I began studying how teachers experienced ERTL, I believed that the central tension for teachers would be the ways in which their expertise was suddenly undermined by the change in mode and context. I assumed that this change would result in an identity crisis, especially for more experienced teachers, and I was interested in what that experience was like for them. Indeed, the data from both the survey and the interviews that I conducted did indicate that most of the teachers who participated in this study were frustrated and exhausted, but interestingly, not for the reasons I had assumed. Rather, what was causing their misery was not threats to skill sets built up over years, but the teachers' values being undermined. These values included those that had brought them into teaching in the first place, which when reinforced, had in the past made teaching rewarding. Generally speaking, teachers join the profession for reasons that reflect their values, and when they choose to leave, we rarely ask what values were undermined. Doris Santoro writes about the moral rewards that are embedded in teaching and serve to motivate teachers to keep doing a difficult job. She describes these moral rewards as being activated when educators feel that they are doing what is right in terms of one's students, the teaching profession, and themselves. Santoro also talked about the ways in which teacher attrition is talked about in moral terms without really engaging with the teacher's reasons for leaving. Calling experienced teachers who leave the profession for ethical reasons principled leavers, Santoro painted a picture of teachers who chose to stop fighting a futile war. In my COVID study, the value mentioned most often by teachers was personal connection. This was closely followed by trust and community. These two values were each expressed by twice as many participants as the next two most prevalent, which were process over product and student-centered curriculum. All of these values were under threat during ERTL, when teachers were forced to teach in ways that undermined their own values, believing that they had no choice but to do so. So we know that a teacher whose day-to-day work contradicts or undermines their values and their beliefs will eventually leave, either spiritually, physically, or both. So let's figure out what is required for a teacher's experience to be the opposite, that is, professional fulfillment. I agree with Santoro that the specific moral rewards that are most salient to an individual teacher depend on the values and beliefs they bring to their practice. But even combined with an understanding of values and beliefs, moral rewards are not sufficient for explaining professional fulfillment. We also need to look at what we mean by professionalism for teachers and how this affects how teachers experience their practice. Andy Hargreaves and Ivor Goodson say that in a complex postmodern age, professionalism is characterized by increased opportunity and responsibility to exercise discretionary judgment over the issues of teaching, curriculum, and care that affect one's students. Also, opportunities and expectations to engage with the moral and social purposes and value of what teachers teach, along with major curriculum and assessment matters in which these purposes are embedded. Also, commitment to working with colleagues in collaborative cultures of help and support. Also, working authoritatively yet openly and collaboratively with other partners in the wider community, so that's especially parents and students themselves, who have a significant stake in the students' learning. Also, commitment to active care and not just anodyne service for students. And finally, engagement in a self-directed search and struggle for continuous learning related to one's own expertise and standards of practice. Oh, and they also argue that the high complexity of teaching needs to be rewarded with social status. This is a lovely depiction of professionalism. However, it boils down to being a description of the ideal circumstances for a teacher to operate as a professional rather than how they might experience it, which is my interest. Still, we can't discount the importance of context and circumstance, so let's have a look at that. Now, we all know that school systems are complex structures that are made up of many people with different ideas, values, beliefs, skills, and understandings. And I am using the term to represent a social structure that, like any structure, is not simply the sum of its parts. It is an entity constituted by legislation, policy, buildings, school boards, and schools through which people move over time, some staying for the mandatory dozen years as children and youth, and others working there as hired, elected, or voluntary adults. But everyone eventually leaves, and the structure remains. Public school systems tend to see teachers as conduits of curriculum rather than active interpreters of it. Specifically, educational aims and objectives are developed by educators hired by the Ministry of Education or its equivalent, whose choices are constrained by the will of parents and other stakeholders. Classroom teachers are then expected to implement those aims and objectives through lessons that they have the knowledge and expertise to deliver efficiently. And then students' outcomes are noted, measured, and reported. In this way, the school system treats teaching as transactional. The teacher delivers a curriculum so that students can earn a credential and move to the next stage of their schooling or career. A great deal of energy goes into developing curriculum and monitoring students and/or, in many jurisdictions, monitoring teachers. But the emotional and intellectual lives of teachers, through professional development activities and various forms of direct or indirect evaluation, are managed rather than nurtured. According to this idea, schooling as a politically informed and collective endeavor has essentially objectified teachers, such that many of teachers' personal motivations and experiences are treated as irrelevant to its purpose. This means that from the point of view of the school system, teachers with equal levels of skills and experience are interchangeable. Gert Biesta calls this the learnification of teaching, where the center of the endeavor is the object of study and the efficient delivery of it to the students, without really taking the teacher as a person bringing something other than skills to the process into account. In other words, in this learnification of teaching, there is little room for teachers' values and beliefs to be considered. Indeed, a teacher who can set their values and beliefs aside and simply do the job as prescribed would be seen as being professional. But am I setting up a straw man here? Surely. If a teacher is to care about the welfare of their students, they would need to hold caring as a value. Altruism is a value that we associate with helping professions, like teaching, an idea that implies selfless service. However, seeing teaching solely as an altruistic profession can limit what we view as acceptable ambitions for teachers, because it implies that teachers should find helping students sufficiently fulfilling that they want nothing more professionally beyond that. In his book, The Good Life of Teaching, Christopher Higgins notes that because teaching is seen as an altruistic profession, teachers are expected to set their own well-being aside and focus solely on their students' welfare. However, he argues that teaching should actually be the expression of one's personal ambitions and deepest motivations. He also said that a teacher who is fulfilled inspires their students to be fulfilled. I would add that given that teaching can be difficult, we can assume that fulfillment will motivate teachers to keep trying in the face of difficulty. The corollary of this is that lack of fulfillment will have the opposite effect. Both Biesta and Higgins highlight the importance of taking teachers' talents, interests, and ambitions into account when considering teaching and learning. However, their conceptualizations are fundamentally individualistic, and there isn't a lot of talk about emotions. So from my perspective, teachers' professional fulfillment is about how they experience their practice, not just how they think about it. Thus, we must look to other scholars to begin to conceptualize the meaning of professional fulfillment as an experience. Reflecting on the ethos of public schooling in post-colonial Africa, Joan Oviawe described public schooling as excellence without a soul. She criticized this Western approach to schooling for emphasizing achievement while treating attention to the health of the learning community as a mere means to an end. In this way, schooling has no room for the notion that the experiences of both students and teachers are inherently worthy of consideration, even when we can't be sure if those experiences affect efficiency of teaching and learning. Indeed, if we are to inject the soul back into schooling, we need to acknowledge that emotions and relationships form the core of teaching and learning. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks describes the classroom as ideally a vibrant place, festive even, where emotions are welcome and community is essential. Thus, to her, a teacher's job is to develop a community of learners who trust each other enough to engage in intense but loving critique. Central to this vision, according to Hooks, is a teacher who is committed to self-actualization within that community. She describes a classroom that rejects idealized individualism, official neutrality, and stereotypical rationality. Instead, it's embracing the messiness of conflict and emotions while remaining committed to social justice ideals. Bell Hooks' vision of teaching resonates with my conception of teachers' professional fulfillment. In practical terms, then, teachers' professional fulfillment is how teachers experience their practice in community in terms of beliefs about teaching, values being upheld, and self-actualization through their professional goals and ambitions. Thus, beliefs, values, self-actualization, and community are essential to teachers' professional fulfillment. To be clear, I do not consider our Western school system to be soulless. We in the West, so to speak, put a great deal of energy into tending to students' emotional lives and social development. Indeed, legally, teachers are in loco parentis. That is, they're expected to care for students in the same way as a responsible parent with 30 children would. However, there is a tension between the enacted beliefs of the school system and the ethos of the classroom. For example, for the school system, the apparent goal is for each student to reach their potential as a future worker and citizen by accumulating knowledge and skills. However, the teachers that I have interviewed and surveyed seem to have broader goals for the students in their classrooms, such as community building and helping students to develop social skills. Not in service of an imagined future workplace, but just because it's important in the moment. And this value was expressed by teachers from kindergarten to high school. But this community building is not just about teachers creating a community for students. Teachers are also part of that community. In other words, teachers as people do not somehow transcend the classroom community that they are trying to create and maintain. And yet, the school system can appear to resist seeing teachers as part of the classroom community. Indeed, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, notes that school systems tend to resist even recognizing the classroom as simultaneously the teacher's workplace and the student's learning space. Instead, it can seem as though the school system sees educators and other supporting professionals in the school as skilled components of a machine that produces students whose potentials have been realized. I do believe, however, that students, teachers, parents, and other professionals and educators within schools know better. They recognize the importance of community and belonging as more than a means to an end. They recognize that, whether we acknowledge it or not, teachers are part of the classroom, school, professional, and larger community. There is no way around this. But what is important for us to recognize here is that it is the matrix of relationships in which a teacher is embedded that forms the substrate for teachers' professional fulfillment. In its absence, there is nowhere for teachers' fulfillment to find purchase. In other words, it is community-based. Although the OECD makes this connection, teachers often must declare the fact in order to agitate for better working conditions. So during the emergency remote teaching and learning that happened during the pandemic lockdowns, this was what they were missing. In the absence of the classroom communities that they had built and were building, professional fulfillment was near impossible. When a teacher is at a professional crisis point to implode, explode, or walk away, as Nias describes, it might manifest as burnout. Burnout isolates individuals, alienates them from their vocation, and minimizes systemic and societal responsibility. However, as a multifaceted, personalized, socially embedded construct, teachers' professional fulfillment is the antidote to burnout. When the conditions that support teachers' professional fulfillment are in place, the workplace is a space that invites teachers' holistic participation in supportive communities that accepts the idiosyncrasies of teachers' lives, personalities, and passions. Such communities would take responsibility for helping teachers through professional crises. Now, I know that some of you have read the flyer for this talk, where I say that teachers' professional fulfillment is a deliberately sought outcome of a systemic standard of care that extends to all participants within a classroom, school system, and profession. But what do I mean by that? For many years, we have, in education circles, been talking seriously about making sure that we acknowledge the fact that students cannot be expected to leave their lives outside of school completely behind when they enter a classroom. Students have experiences related to their demographic categories, such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, or gender, also their physical, mental, and emotional health, their families, their neighborhoods, and their own personal histories. And we know, as educators, that students learn better when we see them holistically. But the recognition of students as people who are connected in multiple local, national, and international social networks is not, in my opinion, merely about helping them to learn better. It is also about respect. Whether recognizing a student holistically is good for teaching and learning or not, seeing students as whole beings is inherently important, and creating a classroom community to which all students can bring their whole selves is inherently worthwhile. Talking to teachers during the pandemic, the greatest source of grief for many was that they had a class that was like that, where students accepted and supported each other. And that community collapsed when they could no longer meet face-to-face. All of the teachers said that the relationships within a classroom are fundamental to teaching and learning. We know that the more feasible it is for every member of a community to bring their whole selves to teaching and learning, the deeper and more meaningful the endeavor will be. But the grief these teachers were experiencing also suggested something that we tend to ignore, and that is that teachers are part of that classroom community too. They're also part of the professional community with other educators and staff in the school, and they are, through the students and parents, and sometimes because of where they live, part of the larger community in which the school is situated, which would seem to suggest that teachers should be able to bring their whole selves to the classroom too. Besides, as they implement the mandated curriculum, the teacher's role is not only to act in loco parentis, but also to be an ideal student, a role model of informed and vibrant citizenship for their students. If this is to be so, teachers must have the opportunity to bring aspects of their whole selves to their work as they see fit, so long as they respect and honor the ethical bounds of their profession. And I think this is what Bell Hooks meant by self-actualization. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, where she describes a classroom where emotion is welcomed. The goal is not necessarily for the students to be comfortable, but to be engaged intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. Conflict is fine and expected. Discussions can be intense, and that is just fine. Feelings might be hurt, but there is always space for reconciliation and growth. For Bell Hooks, this was an ideal classroom community. But I think we would be misunderstanding her if we suggested that this was the ideal classroom community. The specifics of what an ideal classroom looks like will be different for different teachers and students. And there are various ways to explore that idea. But what I will talk about tonight with respect to how teachers experience professional fulfillment is, I couldn't think of a really fancy word, so the sweet spot. A very colloquial term, but it captures what I want to convey. I suspect that every educator who has taught for a few years has experienced the sweet spot, that moment when all of the personalities and histories that students and teachers bring to the educational endeavor are in sync. When tensions between espoused and enacted beliefs disappear, and the values a teacher brings to their practice are upheld. And what those moments look like will be different for different teachers. For Bell Hooks, it was an animated, sometimes raucous, always profound class discussion on a chosen topic. For some teachers I've interviewed, it was seeing kids helping each other. For others, it was the moments when students seemed to understand a difficult topic. Many teachers find the sweet spot in extracurricular activities, coaching and running clubs. Even in the COVID study, with some prompting from me, teachers were able to describe moments during the pandemic when they experienced the sweet spot, when learning new skills or working with students in an environment where grades were almost irrelevant. For me, when I was a high school chemistry teacher, one type of sweet spot was seeing students working independently with their lab partners or groups on an experiment or practical activity, talking about the relevant topic, making connections between the theories we discussed in class and the phenomenon they were observing. Standing at the front of the class on one of those, old school raised platforms behind the front bench where I could watch the students work, it was those moments when I knew that my students didn't need me to guide or cajole them. Their curiosity and skills were enough to propel them through the activity. My point is that a professionally fulfilling career would be made up of many and various instances of that sweet spot. These are moments when a teacher knows that they are in the right place, but the idiosyncratic nature of it means that there isn't a way for the school system to determine ahead of time what those moments will look like. All it can do to facilitate them is create space for teachers to bring their whole selves to the classroom and to their professional community and the larger school community. There needs to be room for teachers to the extent that they feel comfortable, share who they are with these communities. I know that for me, the context necessary for me to feel professionally fulfilled as a high school teacher was a school where I could run my chemistry and science classes in a way that allowed the students some independence and creativity. It was also a school where I could participate in extracurricular activities that had nothing to do with my chemistry degree. So because I'm a dyed-in-the-wool music and drama geek, I was able to not only bring music and performance into the science classroom through student presentations, but also help out with the school's concert band. So what I and other education researchers are saying is that teachers need to be able to engage their own passions in their teaching. To facilitate this, the school system needs to be brave enough to accept the risk of creating space for treating teachers as people within the system while trusting teachers' professional judgment. It also needs to accept and not merely tolerate the idea that students' experiences will vary from classroom to classroom, even when it is the same subject and grade in the same school. And while I am arguing that creating space for community and self-actualization of all is an inherently good approach as far as how students and teachers experience schooling, I have to acknowledge that it can actually enhance the attainment of mandated learning outcomes too. Listen, education is a serious business. The public school system is responsible for the care and learning outcomes of thousands of children and youth. So disentangling the idiosyncrasies of individual teachers from the delivery of standardized curriculum seems like the way to go. And if you read curriculum documents, that is exactly what they seem to be trying to do. But that isn't how classroom communities work. I mean, each class is a community, whether it is acknowledged or not, and the teacher is part of that community, as I keep saying, whether we recognize that or not, and that teacher is a role model. So if we are saying that we want our students to be engaged and eventually fulfilled professionally in whatever they choose to do in the future, then we need to give teachers space to do the same. And such classroom and school communities are neither easy nor static. They require a great deal of effort to balance everyone's needs, and as I said, it's risky, but it's also powerful. In her essay, The Master's Tools Can Never Dismantle the Master's House, essayist and poet Audre Lorde says, within the interdependence of mutual, non-dominant differences lies that security which enables us to descend into the chaos of knowledge and return with true visions of our future, along with the concomitant power to effect those changes which can bring that future into being. Difference is that raw and powerful connection from which our personal power is forged. Lorde is not talking about atomized individuals pursuing their projects. She is talking about interdependence, community, and collective optimism. And here I have tipped my hand. I am not arguing for deliberately encouraging teachers to bring their passion and ambition to their teaching simply because I want teachers to be happy. I am arguing for this because I have a larger social justice agenda. I want students to experience a glimpse of beloved community. If you have not heard of this, this is a vision of community first articulated by Reverend Josiah Royce in 1913 and popularized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where the aims of freedom, caring, and justice are pursued through free, caring, and just means. Every person within a beloved community is entitled to be there simply because they are there, and so long as they aim to uphold its central values of freedom, care, and justice in community. Achieving a beloved community can be seen as the purpose of bell hook's choice to teach to transgress. It can also be seen as an instance of the soulful post-colonial learning community that Joan Osaviowe sought for public schooling. And the legislation governing our schools is fully in line with this. It states, the purpose of education is to provide students with the opportunity to realize their potential and develop into highly skilled, knowledgeable, caring citizens who contribute to their society. Our school system already articulates its espoused beliefs and deepest values as recognizing individual difference, learning for the sake of learning, and caring for students. We want our students to flourish. The recognition of teachers and educators as whole human beings is something that our school system needs to actively seek to create the conditions for teachers to flourish, just as we want students to flourish, just as we want all to flourish. This is the ultimate goal of a beloved community, and that is why teachers' professional fulfillment is important. Thank you. So I guess we open up to questions?
Yes, you do indeed. Yes. I was going to say thank you very much. Just come and squeeze in and say thank you very much, Sarah, for a fantastic talk. We are turning to the question segment of today's presentation. So we can move the mic around and I can bring it across, or do we have a second one over there? We have a second one. Fantastic. Okay, so I shall step away.
Questions or comments?
Start off with one.
Sure.
I was just wondering about these. You drew the attention to these sort of technical documents, the curriculum with its very unemotional, precise language in certain ways, and you sort of contrast that with the work around thinking about the humanising nature of education and about self-actualisation and the whole person and how it connects to community and wider goals. I was wondering, it made me think, I'd be terrified if a government document contains some of those ideas about moral choices and self-actualisation and being your true self. It would sound a bit frightening to me if they were in that space. Is it something we would want government documents to be saying?
Well, interestingly, when you look at the curriculum, and I mean from the very beginning of the public school system, it says all of those things about students.
Well, yeah.
Teachers are essentially not mentioned, but essentially from the beginning, it's all of this stuff is listed for students all the way through and still there. So it is a matter of, I mean, there was a time when the curriculum was written in a particular way where it really was very, very specific, and any teacher coming in would know, okay, I do this on this day and do that on that day. And that's evolved, like since the 1970s. It's always been child-centered in a way, but by the 1970s, they were suggesting things like it was done more individualized. And at that point, they also sort of relaxed the way they were describing what needed to be taught. And so suddenly, and it was around the same time when the teacher education changed. And so the teachers were recognized as being important, but they were recognized as being important simply for being efficient about knowing what kind of lesson they needed to use for that particular child. And so that has evolved. But the description of what students should be, being self-actualization, all of that, that's there from the very beginning, all the way through. So I think that what I'm suggesting is that it doesn't make sense to say that we're doing that if we don't also include the teachers. We all know that students do have a relationship with their teachers. I mean, some are closer than others, but there is a real relationship there. Anybody who's sent their kids to school for the first time and then they come back, and after a month, everything is, well, my teacher says, right? Like there's a very clear, close relationship there. And so this is what I mean by everybody who's in the school knows that this needs to happen. But the system itself, it seems to be like, well, that's okay, but we would really prefer if it was always the same. Like if a kid goes into kindergarten in this room, it's going to be the same as the next room. As if it's some sort of version of fairness, when what is really fair is for the students to have a deep connection and for the for the teachers to have a deep connection with their students. The problem with not acknowledging that is that it feels sneaky for the teacher. So the teacher, feels like if they have a really close relationship with their class, it feels almost like they're not being professional. They'll feel like, if I'm professional, I'm supposed to be able to step back. And really, that definition of professionalism looks great on paper, but it introduces a lot of tension that doesn't need to be there. So long as they track the ethical, like I'm not saying not be ethical, right? The ethical code still needs to be there. They still need to maintain the distance you should have as an adult with kids. But there is a relationship, and they are important adults in the kids' class. And if the system doesn't acknowledge that, it can get very messy. And I would suggest that a lot of the mess that we sometimes see would not be there if people didn't feel like it was something that they could only do on the down low.
I'll try to do it without the mic, because that's okay.
For the recording.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a great presentation. I just wondered if you find there's anywhere in the world or spaces, systems that are close to what you envision. I have some in mind, but they sometimes equate things to happiness of children. And I know you specifically said that's not what you're talking about, and happiness necessarily of the educator is not what you're talking about either. It's the fulfillment and all the things that you pointed to.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that what the examples I've seen have they haven't been based on a structure that was put in place for it to be, possible. It was more a matter of a sort of alchemy that would happen in particular classes with particular students with their teachers. And sometimes it would happen over years. If a teacher had been in the school for a long while and got to know the families, it would happen in those sort of contexts. So again, it's not something that's died into the structure of schooling so much as things that would just sort of happen over time as the teachers develop relationships. It's also, I should also point out that it could sound like it's more likely to happen in kindergarten than it is to happen in grade 12, but that's not true at all, at least not based on the interviews that I've done. It seems that this happens all the way across the entire system, that teachers find ways to sort of connect with their students in this way. So it's more a matter of what I'm looking for is a structure within the school system that sort of accepts that this is what schooling is, and then that can be a basis for providing what is needed for that to happen. Because the resources that teachers need, it's not just about physical resources or a cozy classroom, although those things are important, but also the time to be able to get to know their students, not being buried in paperwork. Here's a good example. Okay, I used to teach a gifted class, gifted high school class, and they were wonderful. And during that year, the government decided that teachers were not allowed to put their own comments on report cards. We had to choose from a list of comments, and that was all we were allowed to use. And I had gotten to know my students, and I was in a very rebellious mood. I was actually, I think I was the branch president in the union at the time, and I was just really annoyed by this. It's like, so I actually that year wrote in my own comments. I actually, said, so-and-so is doing fine here, and you should think about this, and blah, 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 blah. Now, some of you may or may not know this, but the parents of gifted students tend to be very involved. And at Meet the Teacher night, they would always have this long lineup of parents. And so I made a point of always sending home reports to the parents about how their students were doing. And so Meet the Teacher night always happens directly after the report cards have been issued. So I did this, I put my own comments in. This was this major rebellion. I was literally pulled into the principal's office over this. And that year, I had hardly any parents come to see me because they had heard how their students were actually doing for me. Whereas the other ones were all lined up to say, okay, what does this generic thing mean? So, here is a system where they're saying we have to provide feedback. We provide feedback that is based on the relationships we've developed with the students, and we're slapped on the hand for it. That is a really easy structure to fix. And yet. Yeah, you are right. It would be helpful, and schools have enough. They have the freedom to make decisions about scheduling to sort of encourage that. Part of the problem is that they have lengthened they've made a change to the length of the day. Well, now it's been 20 years now, but they lengthened the day, the number of minutes that students are supposed to be learning. That means in a classroom. They don't count lunchtime, they don't count extracurricular, they only count those minutes. But what it has meant is that something like a homeroom, it really puts a lot of pressure on the entire schedule if they have dedicated homeroom time. There are schools that figure out ways to do it, but the structure that needs to be fixed, I think, is thinking of education only as being those minutes that they're in classes, and sort of ignoring the fact that the entire time that they're in that building that they're learning, that there's something happening there. I know that some of the teachers mentioned to me that one of the things that they missed the most was just passing by students in the hallway and saying hello, just making a connection, or in the cafeteria, if they see a student sitting by themselves, going up to them and checking in on them. So all of these sorts of things are not counted. And because they're not counted, it means that it's the first thing that gets squeezed when they need to change schedules. And so you end up with kids having a 30-minute lunch and hardly any time to talk to each other. And then they have to get back into class. So those sorts of, that's a structure that it's a relative, well, for me as an old lady, but it changed like 20 years ago. And you could really tell the difference. It really made a difference in how schools felt.
I feel like the arts student or teachers are given more leeway in that way, that they can be more of themselves, like art teachers, music teachers, that sort of thing. In your interviews, did you see the same? Or I'm sure they suffered a lot during the pandemic as well because we didn't have it.
Yes, that's a really good question, and I did track. Now, of course, in K to 8, there weren't as many differences as far as the subject matter, but I did track that for the high school teachers that I interviewed, and that was about half of them, so like 23, 24 teachers. There was no difference. So not only did I find that from K to 12, there was no difference in the way that the teachers felt that they wanted to feel connected to their students, but it didn't matter if they were a science teacher or an art teacher or history or kindergarten. They were all basically saying the same thing. Of course, it would manifest differently, but it was still about, like I do remember one of the chemistry teachers just talking about how she just missed joking around with the students at the beginning of class before they got into the lesson. This was what they all missed. Like when you put things online, the curriculum can be delivered and you can check everything off, but all of them missed that relationship. There wasn't a single teacher that I interviewed or surveyed who didn't miss the relationships that they had. They did manage to form some very close relationships with some of the students, but they really lamented the fact that they couldn't do it with all of them. It all sounds so sad.
I'm just curious because I was expecting you to touch on finances, like if any of the teachers felt they were underpaid, and if that would have contributed to their sense of fulfillment. But I'm assuming that many of them felt that they were paid well, or because I know in Ontario has one of the highest salaries for teachers, and I think there are over 65,000 that are on the Sunshine List. But I'm just wondering if any of them mentioned finances as a way to fulfillment.
No, none of them. And not in the surveys either. No, they didn't. I mean, as you say, teachers in Ontario are paid pretty well. What I did hear a few of them complaining about was the funding for their students. So, and I found this especially with the teachers who were teaching adult students. The funding is way less for adult students, and they really felt it when things went online. They couldn't fill in the gaps so easily. With Indigenous students, it was similar. Well, actually, pretty well any marginalized group you could think of. There were teachers who were saying, that they were the ones that weren't getting the money. And actually, quite a few of them said, I feel lucky because I have a good job and I can work from home. But some of the families that they were working with really had trouble. Like some of the teachers were delivering food to parents because they knew that they were struggling. Some of them were listening to parents who were basically really on the edge because they could not work. They were running out of money. So that's when finances were talked about, but never with respect to themselves.
Okay, what about issues of changing policies whereby you see maybe some subject areas being way promoted than your professional area, where also not some of those areas which can also demotivate and make you not to fulfill your aspiration in that particular profession?
So are you asking, are there particular subjects that where teachers felt more alienated?
We have been seeing attention going maybe to specific subjects like science, technology, and other things. But so when we say teachers, we are teachers of different So that aspect whereby you see a focus going to only to a certain field without even touching these other fields, where can that not also act as a demotivating factor to some teachers who seem not to be targeted towards that particular promotion?
Yeah, and that actually was a thing. So, and especially during the pandemic when I was collecting this data, that they really promoted particular subjects. So there was, English and math and science and history, the academic subjects, and then there were art and tech and music that were not considered to be so important. And when I talked to those teachers, they had less students who were showing up to their classes or showing up and logging in because those subjects weren't considered as important. But they would just kind of do one of these, right? It's like, yeah, I know my subject's not as important as the other ones, and they kind of accepted this hierarchy, and that made me kind of sad. But so it didn't seem to be making them sad. They seemed to have already accepted that they weren't considered that important. But they did say things like, I had students who were really thriving in my class that weren't necessarily thriving in those academic classes. And now I have no way of really connecting with them because their parents were still trying to get them, if they were going to focus on anything, it was going to be on those academic courses to try and get them to work on that. So the hierarchy exists. It does affect the way teachers experience the way they teach, but it seems to me that they had sort of accepted that hierarchy. And so there wasn't really a tension there for them.
I'm compliant. I really loved the talk. It reminds me of when we used to teach together, and I remember just what a great lecturer you are, so thank you for that. I wondered if you would consider extending or imagining even here your study in the university context. So thinking about professors as teachers and thinking about what you found in the study of the teachers that you interviewed, do you have thoughts about what the context of the university might introduce? I mean, it's a bit of a thought experiment question, but it's also a practical question of whether you would consider interviewing profs as part of what you're trying to investigate in terms of what fulfillment means in teaching in the context of post-secondary ed.
Right. And just so everybody knows, Lisa's my academic twin. Like we came to York together at exactly the same point in our careers. It's interesting because on paper, professors have exactly the structure that you would need to be fulfilled, right? Because we have that academic freedom thing going. But there are these tensions and this idea that, I always think of it, the capitalist university, it's more about, how big was your grant than how deep were your ideas. And that's a real tension because, the university does need money and Tri-Council does give overhead money every time you get a grant. But have I thought about studying that myself? I don't know if I have. There are some authors, as you know, that have written about, there was one book, The Slow Professor, that was just talking about the idea of a professor having an academic life that is more focused on having deep thoughts than producing lots of articles. And the reason that book resonated, I think, was because we can feel that tension that we have this value that we should be thinking deeply about things, and yet the structure, and it's not entirely the university's fault. There is a particular financial situation that post-secondary is in, but it does feel like as a professor, we're supposed to look like we are having that life, but we don't because there are these time crunches, classes are getting bigger, et cetera. So I think it would be fantastic for somebody to do that study, but I don't imagine I will. I always want my research to be surprising. And I think that what I would learn in that study that you're suggesting, I already know. So be like, I know that already. I'm going to learn something new, that sort of thing.
So what
What do I already know about being a professor?
That you don't want to research.
So what I already know is that being a professor is the most amazing and most frustrating job I've ever had. Because on the one hand, we have so much control. You know, we get to choose which 12 hours of the day we want to work. But we also have very real constraints, and it is true that we want our students to have something similar to the sort of passion we feel when we're doing our research and doing our work and doing our teaching. But you're all under all these constraints as well. Like you've got a long commute, you've got your life outside of school, you've got to deal with money, et cetera. And all of these things I know. And so it becomes part of my teaching. I try to keep it in mind. I try to be as patient as possible, give as much leeway as possible. But do I want to study that? For me, what keeps me going dealing with that is doing research on stuff that I don't know. And because being a scholar is about always looking towards what you don't know, it's probably why we all have such precarious self-esteem, because we're always thinking about stuff that we don't quite have a grasp on. That's part of what our work is. So yeah, I think that's what I don't know.
Your vision on the future of teaching profession in terms of number of people you think will be joining this profession in the future, what do you see?
I mean, it's interesting because, of course, we have a very real teacher shortage right now, and a whole bunch of things fed into that. You know, as a faculty, we never have trouble getting people to apply, but becoming a teacher, it takes time, right? You have a couple years in school, then you have 5 years before you really feel comfortable, and so the question becomes, are we sending people into a job where they'll be able to tolerate that? So for me, it's not a matter of how many people are joining the profession, but how many are going to stay. And unfortunately, that's beyond, beyond our purview. But I think that's a really important thing that needs to be thought about.
Dr. Bennett, yeah. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the talk. And as you know, I come from outside education. And I work in the field of occupational health and safety. I had occasion to read some work motivation research and theory where they've taken self-determination theory and applied it to work motivation, sort of looking at the spectrum of extrinsic rewards or motivation to intrinsic. And I wondered if you've had a chance to think about your data from that point of view. If that could be helpful.
Yeah, and although I haven't looked at it in specifically those terms, in a way you can map that onto the idea of, there's context, which would be the extrinsic, and then there's the values and beliefs, which would be intrinsic. I tend to focus on the intrinsic because, context is what it is. However, thinking of it specifically in those terms, I haven't done. So I might pick your brain and have a look at that.
Pass on a paper or two.
Yeah.
I've come from the secondary panel, and to respond to that original question regarding why the shortage, I think within the secondary school context, I've spoken to a lot of teachers within technology and the technical areas, and there seems to be quite a shortage in that area. Yep. And then, as a school, there is more emphasis on pushing females to go into engineering and the trades. But getting back to the shortage in the technical areas, I've talked to some of those teachers and asked them why that's the case. And a lot of them do not come directly from a teacher education or they've come from a teacher education program, but they've spent several years honing a practice, a trade, an apprentice. So they do have another sense of the world of work and, you know, and another community and what that provides for them. So I don't know if it's a question of a different approach to recruiting young people within those technical fields and make it worthwhile for them to go into teaching, because they are seeing more advantages by staying in the private sector. So that's really a different area, and perhaps another area worth investigating.
Yeah, and we do have a specific program in our faculty that's for people that are going into technical subjects. And yeah, I mean, somebody graduates with a technical degree, they'll get a course, they'll get a job. Like it's almost guaranteed. If they speak French, then, you know, they can choose anywhere to teach. It is very much, it's limited because they could be doing something else. And when a person has a trade, there's a certain, you know, I'm not going to say brotherhood, siblinghood. There's a siblinghood to it, right? And there's also a lot of pride in that work. And then they come to teaching and they try to instill that with students. But in order to even be considered to do the program, they have to have already had some time in their career. So that's a big hurdle, since we don't even have enough people in the trades anyway, and then we want to pull some out to be teachers. So that's a situation, yeah, I mean, the numbers aren't there to fulfill what is needed. It's similar with French, like trying to get people for French immersion as well. There are subjects, I had a student once who had as her two teachables French and physics. And I said, you'll get a job, don't worry. You will be just fine. Yeah. But that is rare. In 17 years, I've only had one student with that. So it is a matter of what's in the pool. But what I would suggest is we want our best and brightest to be teachers. So even if you don't care about the inherent worth of each person as an individual, we need to keep in mind that our best and brightest are not going to choose to be teachers unless they have something that they can go to where they can still fulfill, you know, like their intellectual pursuits and their passions. They will leave because they can do other things. Smart people can always do something else. So if we want to deal with our teacher shortage, then we need to keep in mind that if we want the best and brightest, we need to treat them like they're the best and brightest. But that's just my opinion.
Look around the room in a meaningful way one more time before I come on. It looks like we have exhausted the questions.
We've at least exhausted the audience.
Well, one of the two, yes. I won't keep you long. I think I will just note that one of the very important ideas that you described, Sarah, was this piece about how the sweet spot may be different, probably is different for different people at different times. But I'd also like to say that I suspect that the sweet spot was happening in this presentation today when we were thinking so deeply about the nature of teaching, the nature of learning, the nature of professionalism and what that might mean, and the wider civic and the values that we're thinking about in those spaces. Certainly did for me. So I'd like to thank you very much for what was a very, very thought-provoking and thoughtful and beautifully presented piece. I'd like to thank the audience for coming. I'd like to thank the technical crew for setting things up on with the camera, and for the Dean's Office team for their organisation around this piece as they came in. So can I thank you very much. Thank you for coming once again to all the audience, and safe journey back home. Thank you.